Hey, it's Michael, and as we kick off this week's episode, I've got a seemingly pretty simple question for you. Who do you trust? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so. To listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask more, better questions so that we might become more reachable as people. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. I'll ask again, who do you trust? At least here in America, according to the Pew Research Center, we're at or near all-time lows in trust of many of our core institutions and leaders in this country. There are few exceptions, whether it's a priest, a police officer, a legislator, a member of the military, a journalist, or a scientist. These days, the number of people that say they have confidence that these groups will act in the best interest of the public is eroding. Okay, so who do you trust? My guess is you trust your spouse, or perhaps a lifelong friend. You trust a colleague or a coworker. Maybe you trust your parents or your children's teacher. The point is, it's likely someone you're close to. You've met them face to face. You've sat across a dinner table or a workspace from them. You've heard their voice and they've heard yours. They're a part of your tribe in some way. You trust them because you belong to a tighter network. They're your people. Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you've listened to this show at all, you know it can't be explained in that kind of binary. It's so much more intricate than that. That's what my guest and I dive deep into in this episode, the nuance of trust and how do we create more of it. Dan Vallone is the director of More in Common USA. After spending 6 years as an active duty Army infantry officer, which included a tour in Afghanistan, Dan got into the work of education policy and innovation, and eventually began to explore the common factors that exist in broken societies: alienation, isolation, polarization, distrust. As you'll hear in our conversation, Dan views trust as a nebulous and ever-changing thing brought on by influences that exist all around us. Trust is built through communication and experiences with others and is rarely ever linear in nature. Creating more trust across our divides as a society requires some messy, murky, and at times seemingly morally dissatisfying work to get us to the point where we can lift our heads above the field of view of our immediate tribe and see others who exist near and with us who, as Dan explains, more often than not want and value very similar things as you. I want to read you something that I found that you said in another article. It's been a few years now, but I want to get your take on it now after everything that we've been through. So this was in reference to, I believe, your military days, but I want to read you this quote. I realized how rare it is to have people with very different backgrounds who come together through shared value and identity. And my question to you, Dan, is, big question. Gosh, do we have a shared identity right now? In particular, here in the United States, being that you're the director of More in Common USA, do we have a shared identity?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate also that you would frame it by presenting something that I wrote several years ago. And as contradictory to what we see every day in news and on social media, we really do. We really do have a strong shared identity. More Common published a report in late 2020 that we called American Fabric. It was actually the first of a series of reports we are doing on this very question of, do we have a shared national identity? And the findings are strong. American identity is important to about 75% of Americans, and it cuts across race, gender, ideology. Really, the variation in response to this question, you see some variation across generation, but even a majority of younger Americans still say national identity is important to them. They're more proud to be American than they are ashamed to be American. And the other interesting piece that I'll just note about this shared identity is, in addition to being stronger than I think we conventionally think it is, it's also more complex. The majority of Americans are willing to embrace complex narratives about our history and about our nation, recognizing that we have had historic and contemporary failures and injustices, just as we've had periods of exceptional accomplishment and progress. And they see it in a story of progress, however imperfect, over time.
So, Dan, where's the disconnect? Why does it then feel as if, why would I even ask that question then, that it would feel like we are losing a shared identity or shared values as Americans?
Well, I think there's probably at least two drivers of this. The first is, and we should acknowledge that even though you can get agreement on a particular narrative about American identity, and even though we do know that American identity is broadly shared as an important identity across our country, it is important to recognize that we do have issues to address. People, that comes up in surveys, it comes up in focus groups, and you do see it, that the question of whether or not we have done enough to kind of grapple with our historic failings around race, around ethnicity, that's a serious question. And so part of I think the reason why it's sometimes difficult to grasp the salience and breadth of support for a shared national identity is that we have these very serious issues to grapple with, and those merit significant attention in media, et cetera. The other issue, and probably the one that is more frustrating for somebody like me who works in this space, and I imagine for somebody like you, is the pictures that we see of each other are increasingly distorted and divergent. So this is due to a number of factors, including social media, information sorting, geographic sorting, all of these things happening. But the most politically engaged, the most influential voices in our society increasingly reflect a minority of viewpoints and shape a national dialogue that disproportionately elevates more extreme views. And so you get these false dichotomies where you either need to be entirely critical and judgmental towards the country, or you have to be overly and kind of wildly nationalistic and ignore or overlook that we've had any kind of historic or contemporary failings. And those false kinds of ends of the spectrum frame what a lot of people think is the reality of public opinion, when the data would really suggest it's much, much more complex.
What have you found in the work that you do is the best way to break away from those false dichotomies?
It's actually challenging. So we've done experiments where we have presented the data that I just shared to communities of Americans, and the initial response oftentimes is disbelief. So it's not enough for me to say, here's the data that we collected in a rigorous national survey that is accurate within plus or minus 3 percentage points. There's a significant degree of skepticism and distrust towards media, towards expertise in general. So it's not enough to just convey the data. So what that leaves us is we need to do the much harder work of building actual relationships with people of different backgrounds and perspectives, with different kinds of media sources, so we can see this more complex picture of the national conversation. And we need to do this in person and online. And it's daunting because it's hard to get people to show up for a conversation. It's hard to get people to want to engage with people of different backgrounds and perspectives. So this really needs to be a much broader effort across all sectors of our society if we want to help break out of these false dichotomies.
Dan, something you said there is really interesting to me, and I want to dive deep into it. You said there is a skepticism of expertise. Can you pinpoint? Maybe it's not a pinpoint. Maybe can you paint a broad brush of where that skepticism comes from? Why do we feel that skepticism towards people who have invested their lives in becoming an expert in a topic or an area of study?
Sure. So I will point to three drivers of this skepticism. And we published a report in 2021 that I would point folks to. It's called Two Stories of Distrust. But the three drivers, I would say, are one, legitimate failures on the part of experts across a number of different domains in relatively recent history. The second is ideology and partisan identity. And the third is what we describe as social distrust. And I'll walk through those three quickly. The first is, I think we have to concede and recognize that the past 20 years have featured major events, wars, massive financial crisis and recession, global economic volatility, a global pandemic. In each of those cases, you had lots of experts who were revealed to be, again, I don't, on some instances, lying and intentionally misleading the public. More often than not, I mean, as is the case in lots of these complex areas, articulating positions and asserting ideas that then were proven to be not accurate or untrue to varying degrees. And so there's a lot of earned distrust, I think, out in our society right now, particularly among younger Americans for whom the last 20 years is the majority of their life experience. But again, that's out there. I don't know that I would say that that's a significant driver relative to these other two. The second is what we describe as kind of ideological distrust. And this is where you see really sharp divergence in public opinion when you ask people about how much confidence they have in people like scientists or journalists or public health officials. And so what you see over the last 6 years in particular, Democrats exhibiting very high levels of trust towards the media in general, towards scientists, towards people who have kind of credentialed expertise, and Republicans expressing much lower levels of confidence. And so they have much higher levels of trust towards other individuals and institutions, but it is very different from what Democrats express. And so as a result, even somebody who is well-credentialed as an expert probably has limited reach in this media and kind of political environment. And the third driver, and probably the equally as challenging as the ideological distrust, is what we describe as social distrust. And we get into this in the report, but basically we make the case that trust is not linear in nature, right? So I don't just have a set of relationships with various institutions that are entirely independent of each other and independent of my relationships of trust that I have with other people in my life. All of it kind of is mixed together, right? So trust is a result of a lot of different behavioral and kind of attitudinal variables that you develop growing up, that are shaped by your lived environment and that are influenced by the actual institutions that we're dealing with. And so what we find in the data is that there is a significant slice of the population, probably about 30%, who express much lower levels of belonging in any group or community, who have much higher levels of generalized distrust. When you ask them, can most people be trusted, or do you need to be more careful when dealing with people, they are much more likely to say you need to be careful with dealing with people. And we ask them about how often are they treated with dignity in community, at work, etc., much lower than the average. And so you can see that population exhibits distrust for a much different reason than a Democrat or Republican who has an ideological orientation towards institutions. But all three of those drivers are occurring at the same time.
In those moments where an expert has been proven to be not just wrong, but I'll use the phrase maliciously wrong, they intended to mislead or misguide through their work, what can well-intentioned experts do to stave off kind of this, perhaps a blanket damning of all experts that seems to occur? What can they do?
Sure. So the good news is that there's a number of strategies and steps that folks can do, and we saw a lot of this play out with COVID in particular. You did have a lot of innovation in terms of public health officials finding creative ways to get the message out. Same thing was done around election integrity in 2020. And so there are a few things that are key to do. One is think about who are the credible messengers for the audiences you're trying to reach, and how can you bring them into your communication. So if you're trying to reach audiences who exhibit distrust towards institutions and individuals that they think are liberal, then can you bring in kind of credible voices who have legitimacy with more conservative Americans, whether that's veterans, law enforcement, more local business leaders, et cetera, bringing in those voices. The second is to diversify the platforms that you are communicating across. Again, over-relying on any set of media platforms to get your message out is going to both limit your reach and then ultimately cause other individuals to see you as being associated with the left, the right, et cetera. So you really need to think about, how can I be active on multiple platforms that reach an ideologically diverse set of audiences. The third, and I think the kind of connects back to the point that I started with, is how can you be communicating either in person or via community groups who have that more sustained engagement with audiences. I think that it's more difficult, again, and kind of impossible for some experts to be in everybody's living room. But if you want to tell a more complex story, you really need to build a trusted relationship, and that benefits from proximity. And I guess the last point that I would say is, this is less on the experts and more on us as a society, but we need more platforms like this podcast where you have complex conversations, where somebody can come into this space and not feel like they're going to be judged for either not knowing information or for having a divergent viewpoint from the expert at the beginning.
Do you think we're willing to have those in-person conversations and step away from the squawk box of social media and have those? In the work that you've done, are we willing to step away and have those nuanced, uncomfortable conversations?
So we're definitely willing. I would say the challenge comes in that it's not clear at this moment in time that this is a top priority for most groups in America. I think that when you talk to most Americans, when you do polling, when you do focus groups, when you just go out, we do a lot of interviews with just kind of folks from across the country. The idea of talking with people and hearing from a diversity of viewpoints very rarely gets a negative reaction, especially if you frame it fairly neutrally. But it also isn't top of mind for most people. And among the segments of our population who are higher on levels of distrust, it's a lower priority. And so I think the challenge comes in that in order to make it a higher priority, to make it accessible, we need to have this be something that actors at the national, state, and local level really get into and lean into. We need folks and groups that have credibility on the left, on the right, across community groups to see this as a priority, because at the end of the day, the more we're able to have these complex conversations, the more we're able to kind of break down some of the barriers of distrust, we will benefit in our collective capacity to identify and solve problems, avoid polarization further pulling us apart, and kind of improve people's lives in a more tangible way.
Dan, how did you get interested in this work and the work that you do with More in Common USA and leading those efforts? What drew you in?
Sure. And so I started my career as an Army officer. And so I think without fully appreciating it at the time, I kind of started my professional life in this institution where I served alongside people from every part of the country, of every political orientation, diversity of viewpoints, et cetera, and loved it and had this incredible experience of feeling both a deep sense of solidarity with such a diverse set of people, and at the same time, the space to kind of articulate my own viewpoints. I mean, the Army certainly has a very powerful team identity, but within that, individuals have their own viewpoint and their own personality. And so that really stuck with me as this incredibly rich and powerful experience. What drew me into this work specifically was actually, I was working in New Hampshire doing state level community and some advocacy work. And there were two projects that I was involved in. One was a professional effort to try and help a city in New Hampshire reimagine education for its students. And it involved a lot of community engagement, and it was led by an ideologically diverse group of individuals and organizations in the city. And that was unusual. And I really enjoyed the fact that we were trying to stitch together this diverse set of actors who could speak to the left, who could speak to the right, who could speak across lines of difference of race, of age, of gender, et cetera. And it worked. It was a very successful project. And at the same time, in my personal life, I was very involved in veterans groups. And there too, I found myself working in these spaces where people had complex identities. And so that really resonated with me. And when More in Common launched in the United States in 2018, their mission immediately spoke to me. And I was just fortunate to be able to come aboard as the first US director.
Being able to lead and manage those conversations and pull in, like you said, people from the left, people from the right, and to have those nuanced offline conversations, what is the skill set of someone who can lead those conversations in a fruitful way?
Yeah. It's a great and important question. And I would say we actually maybe want to think about two types of these conversations. The first and most immediate that we need is often what we might describe as in-group conversations. So if you were just imagining the left and the right, there needs to be conversations within each of those respective ideological camps about the importance of reaching across the aisle in this case. And those conversations happen within each political group. And the skills you need to have in that setting are, one, you need, I think, a lot of empathy and respect for the diversity of viewpoints within either the left or the right. You need to be willing and thoughtful about how you ensure folks feel heard in the conversation, while at the same time orienting the group towards a common set of kind of goals and outcomes that you want to move the conversation towards. And third, you want to be consciously framing a shared identity that the group can kind of keep on coming back to. And in the case of the left or the right, it might be a liberal identity or identity as a Democrat. On the right could be a conservative identity. The second type of conversation is when you actually start to work across ideological groups. And the skill sets are very, very similar, although I think here you really need an appreciation for how people show up differently based on their ideological orientation. And so, for example, there's a great group out there called Braver Angels that does this kind of red-blue dialogue a lot. And they oftentimes start with the in-group conversations and then bring people in together. And so the facilitation skills for a bridging conversation are slightly different from an in-group conversation, but they share a lot of similarities.
You used a couple words that I want to dive into. One is empathy and having that sense of empathy. How do we gain more empathy? Can that be learned or taught or built in us? Is that a muscle that we can flex?
So it definitely is. I think, when More in Common draws on social psychology as our kind of core area of research for a lot of our work. And if you dig into the literature, you find a lot of research that underscores the extent to which humans are somewhat tribal in nature. It is relatively easy for us to withdraw or entrench ourselves within narrow identities that we feel a sense of safety, that we drive a sense of safety and belonging from, and that might orient us with animosity towards others. At the same time, the data and research makes very clear that we also have an innate orientation of curiosity, of collaboration, and of empathy. That we are social creatures as well. And so this comes naturally under the right conditions. And I think it is figuring out how do we create those conditions in ways that are accessible for more Americans. And one of the things that More in Common does, both to help us in our own efforts to be more empathetic towards the diversity of viewpoints, but then also to help communicate this when we do public-facing work, is we run a lot of focus groups and interviews with Americans of all kinds of backgrounds. Right now, for example, we have an online research community of about 275 Americans who broadly reflect the country's population overall. And we talk to them 2 or 3 times a week. And it's just that, and we ask them, for example, how would you like us to describe you? What identities are important to you? And it surfaces things like, as much as we describe people as Democrats or Republicans, rarely are political identities anywhere near the top in terms of what identities are important to us. Family identities are so much more important. Identities based on the values that we prioritize, like hard work, compassion, much, much more commonly cited as what's important to describe a person. And that helps us be empathetic by seeing people through a different lens than when we categorize them based on their ideology.
So Dan, you perfectly set me up for the other thing that I wanted to explore with you, identity, and in particular political identity. The question that I have, and I don't know if this is the right question to ask, but is political identity helpful? Like aligning ourselves with a political party, I'll even say that, maybe not even an ideology, but a political party. Is that helpful?
That is a great question, and I feel like it's one of those questions that is kind of epic and timeless in nature. And I'm sure you actually get a lot of people that have diversity of views on this, I guess, because, right? I mean, going back to the very founding of America, the idea of political parties, conflicting views. I think my personal take and what I see in our data and the work that we've done over the past 4 years is that, yes, there is actually a lot of value to having political identities in a democracy that is diverse, hyper-connected, and that we want to be inclusive and pluralistic. That if we want to have a diversity of viewpoints, not just tolerated, but at times celebrated as well, political parties are an effective way for us to channel what otherwise could be even more extreme kind of attitudes towards each other. So at their best, political parties, particularly in our country, dissipate the intensity and conflict because they allow us to actually solve problems. They allow us to organize in ways that we can ultimately see our efforts rewarded by changes in policy, changes in laws, or at the very least, like through experiences with other Americans. What we've had in certainly the last 10 years, arguably probably goes back further than that, we've seen political parties stop serving that purpose. And in some ways, they have become vehicles to accelerate more extreme views, to accelerate the conflict. There's a whole range of organizations working on a set of reforms to try and address some of the structural issues behind that. I think there's also broader issues. We've been touching on a lot of them that we have to address as a society, but I still think that political parties are more beneficial than they are damaging to our society, and that we can look across the countries that More in Common works in, for example, to see that it's not just our two-party system that is driving our fracture and polarization. There are similar trends happening in European countries that have parliamentary systems and multi-party systems. So there's a lot going on, and we shouldn't just see it through the lens of political parties causing the problem.
Jumping back to what you were talking about, the distrust that is so prevalent, or that you see in the data that you all find in More in Common, the idea of social distrust. Where did that spring up from? What are the factors that have led to that more? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to get an understanding of, perhaps as we take the conversation this way, how do we begin to bring that distrust back in? I'll just frame it as this. We have so many discussions about our ideologies, about our political identities, about the things that we care about our values, and we seem to try to force that on someone else who we don't have that shared trust with. To change anyone's mind, to even believe that people can change, you have to have an element of trust there, that you can have a conversation, that you can get in uncomfortable with someone, and they're going to trust that you have their best interests at heart. It feels like, Dan, we have so many conversations where we have not established trust first. How do we get there? How do we begin I know it's a huge question, but how do we begin to establish trust when so much of our lives are lived online, where it is really, really hard?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is a huge question, but it's also the right question to be asking. And Of course, with any like good question, the answer on the one hand is kind of like it depends. It depends on the circumstances and specificities. But
Of course.
broadly speaking, I think one thing that, again, we have to kind of talk more about and get into is like, one, this begins with families and communities. So that is just where so much of our sense of trust and distrust begins and is developed. And so thinking about that lens of family, community, what institutions are active in people's lives when they're growing up. I mean, this gets at a lot of kind of like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone kind of work. But I actually think in our particular circumstances now, an additional lens that we can bring that is solution-oriented is we can look at the institutions and organizations that organize Americans to solve problems. And so these are political movements, these are advocacy groups, these are kind of movements that on the left, on the right, that don't have a partisan lens, et cetera. One of the shifts that has been chronicled over the last 20 years is that increasingly those institutions have shifted from what might be described as a membership model back in the maybe 50s, 60s, and 70s to a managerial model. And by that I mean they are increasingly transactional in nature. They reach out to Americans to try and organize them with the express purpose of addressing a particular issue: climate change, immigration, racial justice, healthcare, housing, education, et cetera. But the relationship is often one of an elite kind of organization that is often situated in DC or in a kind of large urban area that then has these chapters that are, again, pushing a national agenda. The other model that we could develop more robustly is membership groups, organizations that concede some of their agenda to develop power and voice within the communities that they are a part of, where you don't have somebody trying to say, hey, it's really important that we pass the Senate bill X, Y, and Z, and instead think about what does this community itself see as a priority? How can I help build power within this community? And that doesn't necessarily have an ideological orientation, but that model is much more effective at building trust. It's much more effective at building a sense of civic agency, which also reinforces trust. And so the more that we could shift some of our, I think, political organizing and activities towards that kind of work, I think it would really benefit. And great academics like Hari Hahn at Johns Hopkins University have done research into this to show how we might make some of these transitions in our society.
With the distrust of experts that we previously talked about, the question that comes up in my mind, Dan, is what is the responsibility of the individual then? Like, what role do we individually play to be able to even trust that these institutions and these organizations have our best interests at heart, or have a worthy cause that we would even want to be involved in and with? What's the individual responsibility?
I really appreciate the question because I do think it is underexamined oftentimes. I think we often, in these kinds of conversations, look towards structural forces for understandable reasons and tend to neglect that individuals do have a responsibility, particularly in a democracy, to try and do things like diversify their media consumption, to be active to the extent that they are able to in community organizations, in civic opportunities, to follow and engage with local news, local politics, local issues that then hopefully then scale up into state and national involvement as well. I think it ties back to the point that I just talked about around membership organizations and kind of institutions for how we channel our political activity. I think some of the best institutions, if you look over history, not only provide a really rich space where there is an attitude of belong before you believe, right? So they open the door to people who don't need to face some sort of ideological screening before they're able to be part of this. And then over time cultivate a shared sense of commitment to particular values that are framing. But these great institutions also ask of their members to take responsibility for the organization. Responsibility is a habit. It's a ritual. We cultivate it as people by doing it, by having responsibility in various domains of our life. But if we don't have that chance to actually shoulder responsibility, we don't build that habit. And certainly, like, I don't want to dismiss there are structural barriers that are out there for particular groups of Americans that inhibit this. But we really do need more Americans to find opportunities to take responsibility, particularly in civic and politics, but I would say even just more broadly in our kind of social and community life.
Early on in our conversation, Dan, you referenced a study that More in Common had put out there that we're actually more willing to have these conversations, more willing to stand in that discomfort and really have those shared values, have that shared identity as Americans. Do you find, though, that it becomes difficult for people to even begin to believe that, to have the conversations? Do you run up against that in the work that you all do, that people are distrustful of even the fact that it's not as bad as it seems?
Yes. No, absolutely. It's very true. And I think that they're distrustful that they won't be judged, I think, in various dimensions, right? So I think if you're talking about trying to bring people together across different faiths, there's a strong sense that the other side will judge them or bring negative kind of perspectives into the room. Ideologies or race, generation, we encounter all of these misperceptions that are anchored in some sort of lived experience or learned experience. And so it is a significant challenge to having these kinds of conversations, is this belief that they will in fact be much worse than they tend to actually be. And I think we've done several experiments on this. Lots of other great groups out there are doing it kind of on a day-to-day basis. And what has become clear to us is, again, we would really benefit from a diversity of experiences where it shouldn't just be, hey, let's show up and talk to somebody who has a very different background from me, but have a conversation in a community setting where people feel very, very comfortable, but talk about the importance of engaging folks who have different backgrounds. Elevate these misperceptions. Actually, like, what do we think this other group feels towards us? And then go out and find the data to say, like, oh, is that true? Is that accurate? Or are we being influenced by a false perception about the other side, about the other groups? Those kinds of in-group conversations are much more accessible for, I think, a broader range of Americans, and then set the conditions for another conversation where that might be with people of the different background.
It seems to me, Dan, then, that when that works up to a point, and then when decisions have to be made, we backslide into our tribes, our identities, our ideologies. And that's the point of breakdown, where we can't agree on the decision that needs to be made, or the decision that is made, we don't agree on that. How do we bring the conversations of shared value, shared identity, and common ground and diversity of thought into the decision-making process that leaves people, not everyone perhaps satisfied, I don't want to use that word, but like we have come to a decision that moves the conversation, the idea forward? Does that question make sense?
I think so, and I'll try and answer it. And if it's clear that I'm confusing, then please stop me. But I think I think what your question makes me think of is another issue that is both cause and consequence of everything we've been talking about. But that is the nationalization of everything, where, to your point, a lot of these decisions that seem to push us away or push us into antagonistic position, identity groups, are around national or perceived national issues. One step we could take is by kind of breaking out of that, by having more, again, more of our political and civic organizations be focused on local and state issues, where it's still very hard, but it's much easier to actually create the conditions for healthy conversations and compromise and good decisions on local issues than it is at a national issue, where it's ultimately like Congress, whether or not Congress passes the bill, and there's so few influences at that point in terms of whether a bill is successful or not in Congress. But if you're at the city council level, if you're at a school board level, there's lots of avenues that you can kind of create change and set the conditions for healthy dialogue and healthy decision making. And I would underscore that increasingly we think that that's not possible at the local issue. Like, I think if you were to ask people their perspective on, like, school boards in America right now, they would just say that, oh, there's a ton of animosity, there's a ton of division happening at the school board level, at the city council level. And certainly you see an increased coverage of those issues and an increased in actual experience of those issues. But it's still true that the reality is more complex and more positive than we think. People are not as divided as we think at the local level around education, around all these issues. And so I would say a big step would be if we could find ways to focus more of our energy activity towards local and state than having national be the aperture through which we see everything.
Is it fair to say perhaps another way, and this is something I've said quite a bit recently, care about your sphere of influence? And if your sphere of influence doesn't have enough diversity of thought, if the only people around you look, think, act, and believe as you do, that's where the problem begins, not where in the areas where you don't have influence, like you said, at the national level. Am I paraphrasing you okay there?
Yeah, no, definitely. Absolutely. I think being responsible for and aware of your sphere of influence is a tremendous responsibility that we all should and can take.
So, Dan, where does the work of More in Common fit into all of this? What describe the work that you all do? I know it's an international organization, in fact, but um, what is the work that you all are trying to perpetuate out there?
Sure. Yeah. So we think of our work across kind of three streams. And to your point, like we work in the U.S., the U.K., France, Germany, kind of across Western democracies. And the first thing we do is we are a research organization. So we try and identify, in particular, misperceptions and I think inaccurate diagnostic frameworks for what's happening in each of the countries we work in. So our best known report in the US is our 2018 report called Hidden Tribes, where we segmented the population into 7 distinct profiles based on their underlying core beliefs, not their demographics and not their political identity. And it provides a much more accurate and complex picture of like Americans' identities, beliefs, values, etc. And we do that kind of work across all the countries, in part because polarization creates these false perceptions about one another. So we really need to try and lift up these more complex realities. The second thing we do is storytelling. So a big part of how we kind of can shift the needle on a lot of these issues is by finding new ways to tell compelling stories about the bigger us, about what it means to be American, about our American story. I mean, in ways that are compelling, in ways that reach across our lines of difference, and that resonate across our lines of difference. And so figuring out how do we create new media products, how do we influence people who write books, who create movies, who run TV shows, trying to get those more complex stories out into a diversity of platforms and mediums is a key part of our work across everywhere. And the third is we do work within and across civil society and politics to try and apply the insights of our research towards efforts that connect people on the ground. I just talked about the importance of management versus membership models in civil society. Trying to help groups wrestle with those kinds of decisions is a key part of our work because ultimately we think that shifts the needle in people's like lived experience with politics, with civics, and with democracy.
What's the most frustrating aspect of the work that you do?
So well, maybe you're gonna ask this next, but I'll start with saying the most rewarding is like every day we discover, or not every day, but like every week we discover again that there is more possibility out there than we oftentimes think, and that there is an appetite for this kind of work in all corners of the country, and that is enormously rewarding and uplifting when you have that opportunity, and it's a privilege to be able to kind of see that. I think the most frustrating piece is to at the same time to hear from so many Americans the frustration they have, the pain that they feel because we are unable to kind of grapple with our issues in a healthy and constructive manner. The pain that actually inflicts on so many people, and to see, I think, the unresponsiveness of so many of our institutional actors to that very real pain, and that cuts across our society, cuts across left and right. And so I think that the degree to which we have some of our political institutions in particular, but a lot of our institutions have grown disconnected from a lot of Americans' lived reality is frustrating. And I think that it's a huge challenge that we need to work on.
You did mention the most rewarding part, but I want to phrase it perhaps a little bit differently because I definitely am going to go here. I want to phrase it like this, Dan. What gives you hope?
I mean, there's a ton of things that give me hope, but I would say for this field, a few things. Like one, there is a growing movement of organizations and actors across the left and the right who are trying to figure out new ways for Americans to come together, solve our problems in ways that don't tear us apart, and move the needle and make progress, oftentimes in small ways, but tangible ways to improve people's lives. And so if you think about what this ecosystem looked like a decade ago and what it looks like now, there is exponential growth. And arguably, I mean, its impact is still building, but that's a huge case for hope, huge case for optimism. The second, and this is something that More in Common is is uniquely positioned to see, is we talk to Americans every single day. Like, we are out there engaging folks online, offline, in research in various ways. And over again, we see this more complex, uplifting picture of the country. The willingness to engage with nuance and with murky realities about our past, our present, and what we aspire to as a nation. And the kind of underlying optimism that a lot of Americans still have. More Americans believe our best days are ahead of us than behind us. Like, that is a compelling statistic that we hear play out in interviews and focus groups all the time. So we get a chance to be inspired by and to see the optimism that is out in the country. And that's a huge force for all of us to tap into in politics, media, civil society, and kind of across the spheres of our lives.
How do we then take what you just said, take the rewarding aspect of the work that More in Common does, and I'll use the phrase attack the issues that you just talked about, the bad faith actors at institutions that feed on or seem to feed on the division, the polarization, the incentive structures of how they're incentivized to either remain in office or remain in their position or gain more clicks, likes, followers, all that kind of stuff, views. How do we appropriately affect those folks and get them to understand that there is an appetite for a different way?
Yeah. I mean, this is such a important and complex question, and my answer will be a little dissatisfying. But in the spirit of like a concise answer, there's two things. One, I think, and this is my assumption, my assertion. It's not a fact, but I believe that oftentimes we are overly influenced by a total victory fallacy. This belief that we can, through whatever set of measures, entirely defeat all of the forces that you just described, right? And that there will be some sort of clear victory where everything is corrected and made good. And unfortunately, like, a lot of research and a lot of just kind of my own experience would suggest that's not going to happen, that the path forward towards improvement is much messier, murkier, and morally dissatisfying. But at the same time, it's real, tangible, and possible. And so what that looks like is trying to engage as broad as possible as coalitions as we can to figure out what are those slices of common ground where I can build a relationship, however small, however kind of on the margins, and grow that so that you're building stronger in-group forces of moderation where the norms that are set in our political institutions and organizations are being anchored by forces of moderation and not by forces of extremism. And what that means is oftentimes you're working with actors that you disagree viscerally with and accepting compromises that feel very dissatisfying. And obviously there are some issues where compromise isn't the appropriate way to go, but if we want to address and really get after the forces that you're talking about, it is kind of the inevitable and path that we have to pursue on multiple levels.
I love that answer. I'd never heard of the total victory fallacy, but I'm going to start using that, Dan. So
there's a great group. There's a great book. It's actually about the military, but it's called Zero Sum Victory by Chris Kalenda, and it's about the military.
Yeah.
But there's an analogous, I think, adoption that can be applied to our politics and political culture.
Absolutely. Last question for you here, Dan, and I ask it of all my guests. But what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
Well, I really enjoyed that. I think that last question, because I think I do frame. I appreciated the framing and the kind of answer that it enabled me to share. I think the question, I've never been asked this. I think a question that I wish I was asked more. I think the question for someone like me who does research and who's heavily involved, the question that I got asked more would be, that I wish I was asked more, it would be about how do Americans describe themselves? Like, what are the real narratives about our identities and about our national identity? It's kind of what you led off with to a certain extent. Like, what is our shared national identity? The question I kind of wish I was asked more is, how do Americans themselves articulate that? Because I think it allows for just such a complex conversation that flips people's or punctures people's misperceptions about what the state of our national identity really is, and opens up all kinds of space for people to feel or to hear something interesting and compelling.
I know you kind of touched on it at the beginning as we talked about that, but I do have to ask the question now that you've said you wanted it asked. Yeah. And I know that this is going to be a super challenging question for us to tackle here in the last few minutes of our time, but how do we define ourselves? How do we describe ourselves?
Yeah. So there's when we do this in research, obviously you see there's a diversity of viewpoints, but there are several touch points, I would say, that you see show up in people's answers in multiple ways, and this cuts across race, ideology, age to a certain extent, gender, etc. There are a few points. I think one, story of progress. That is a very compelling American narrative where people acknowledge our failures, they acknowledge the things that we have gotten wrong in multiple time periods, and see it, and at the same time see this arc towards a better present and a better future. And that's a very powerful narrative that we see. And oftentimes it's the other important point about a story of progress driven by real Americans. You will see entrepreneurialism and the kind of dynamics of our economy certainly show up, but at the root of this story of progress is like everyday Americans somehow working together, figuring things out, moving the ball forward in a way that is better for more people. The second narrative touch point that we see oftentimes is redemption. And this shows up in many different ways, right? There's a biblical connotation to this in some narratives. We see there's an underdog narrative to this as well, or a second chance. But this idea of like redeeming, the possibility to redeem oneself, one's nation, one's community, I think very, very powerful. And I think the last point, and it's articulated in a number of different ways, and it's captured oftentimes in this idea of kind of e pluribus unum, out of many one. And so again, that's rarely the language Americans use to describe it, but there is this sense that this distinguishing feature of America is that we are organized around a set of values, beliefs, and ideals, and not an ethnicity or a faith or a particular kind of belief system outside of a religious belief system. And that's compelling. I think people really appreciate that. And that might be kind of, again, it's expressed in different ways, but we see that show up in multiple sentiments that we analyze.
Well, Dan, that is a fantastically uplifting and positive place to leave it. I love that. Thank you so much for this conversation. This has helped me just frame so much of just how I think about things as well. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that More in Common USA is doing. How can people, I'm going to link up all the studies that you referenced so people can go and check that out for themselves, but how can people become more aware of the work that you all are doing? And if they want to get involved, I assume, right? How can they do that?
Sure. Yeah, I think we really appreciate you sharing all the links. And if folks want to sign up for kind of a newsletter, that's a great way to hear about our additional research. And our model is to try and uplift all the amazing work being done by organizations on the ground across the country too. So we'll do our best to also provide more information on opportunities to actually get involved with groups that are doing things in communities at the national level at multiple multiple points of entry.
Fantastic. Dan, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, sir, and best wishes to you, and keep up the incredible work that you're doing, all right?
Great. Thank you. Really appreciated this conversation. Thank you.
So many thanks to Dan Vallone for sharing his story and perspective here on the show this episode. Please do me and Dan a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Dan Vallone that I have on each and every episode, please subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.